And now a little story from the Appleseed.
So I make a living telling stories. My dad can't believe this. I talk to my dad very often, almost every day, and he always says, not always, but every now and then, he says, Mijo, it's amazing you make a living as a storyteller because you are like the 10th best storyteller in our family. Which sounds like an insult, but if I were to go through the top 9, it's a Bronx Bombers list. It's amazing. So top 10 in my family is pretty good. And part of what I do is I do a lot of work with teachers and parents. What the Appleseed does. Here's a story. Does that spark a memory? Go home and share those memories. And I told Sam today earlier, it's a folk art. It's not a fine art. You guys are fine artists. You have worked thousands of hours to do this thing that you do. And maybe if I practiced 1,000 hours, I would never sound like that. But still, it's different. But folk art, storytelling, we all do it. And so as I've been working with teachers and understanding the power of story, I then had children. And it's an odd thing. I tell parents to tell stories to their children every night. Of course, we read all the time. But I come home from telling stories all day long, 6 hours of storytelling in a school. And I sometimes can't tell stories to my own children. The old proverb, in the shoemaker's house, shoeless children. And I realized that this was something I was going to change. So when my son was 2 years old, 1.5 years old, before my daughter was born, every night, the same routine, tuck him into bed, his little teddy bear, reading a story, and then telling him a story. When he was younger, that worked okay because I could tell the same story over and over again. I could tell the barking mouse 50 different times. When he was about 4 years old, he's like, Dad, I've heard that story before. That's okay, I got plenty of stories. And I would go through my entire repertoire. So it took me a long time to get to the end of my repertoire, 5 or 10 minutes at a time, every night with my son. Until finally, now I was telling stories to my son was 5, my daughter was 2, and I would tell stories to both of them. And then my son would say, Dad, tell me a story I haven't heard before. So this got me going through all of the family members. And I have a lot of family members. So a little story about Cousin Maddie and Cousin Marky and Cousin Julie and Uncle Mike and Uncle Pat and Tio Tito y Tia Clara and Maria, all the way through until when he was about 6 years old, he said, Dad, tell me a story that's true from your life that I haven't heard of ever before. And I'm like, honey, I'm at the end of my stories. And then I came across, working with some teachers, this quote from Albert Einstein: if you want your children to be smart, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more smart, he says, if you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. I love telling personal stories of my family from the 2 cultures, but then I began to realize there are a lot of fairy tales out there. And there would be a time when I don't think there's a way you can run out of reading fairy tales. So I began to go through the fairy tales. And then sometimes I would sort of read or sort of learn the stories, and I would collapse into bed next to one of my children. And my daughter would always say, no, Dad, stand up and tell stories. So I peel myself out of the bed, and she says, no, Dad, do that thing you do when you're telling stories with your hands. So I'm like trying to perform at 8 o'clock at night for my kids, doing the thing, collapsing in bed again. And I began reading the Grimm fairy tales. You know many of these stories. Who's ever heard of Cinderella? Who's heard of Rumpelstiltskin? Who's heard of, Hansel and Gretel? Who knows the original version from the actual Grimm stories? Now, their name is Grimm. Their last name is Grimm, and the original versions are also Grimm. So I didn't read the stories first before I was reading stories to my children until I'm trying to edit on the fly as we're going along. And now my son is old enough. He's now 10, where he wants the original Grimm fairy tale versions. And I found them in Spanish, so we read them in Spanish. And that led me to who is the Grimm fairy tale brothers of Spain and Cuba and Mexico, and I'm finding these old resources, and we're reading these stories at night. So one of the stories I want to share with you is the very first story in the Grimm's collection that I have. You probably know it. I'm going to tell it as close to the original as I can and still have it suitable for family audiences. There once, a long time ago, when wishing still was worth something, a king, a queen, and 3 children. And the youngest girl delighted in playing with a golden ball. How was it golden? I don't know. It's a fairy tale. But she would take that golden ball and she would see her reflection in it. And then as she got older, she learned how to throw it in the air and catch it, and then throw it higher and catch it, and throw it and do spins and catch it and do cartwheels. It was the delight of her days. Not too far from the castle, there was a forest, a deep, dark forest. And one day, as she was playing with the ball, she dropped it, it started to roll, and it rolled directly into the forest, but that girl was not letting her favorite golden ball get away, and into the forest she went, following that ball until she heard splash. Golden ball went down into a well or a pond, and she sat there, and she started crying and crying. And out of that well came the most hideous frog, splat. She looked up at the girl. Why are you crying? She said, you're a frog that talks. I'm a magic talking frog. I can get that ball for you. She said, you can. Thank you, magic talking frog. What will you give me if I get it? Oh, frog, I will give you whatever you want. I will give you jewels. I'm a frog. I don't need jewels. I will give you clothes to wear, the finest silk. I'm a frog. I don't need silk. What will you give me? Whatever you wish. I wish to be the royal frog pet. I want to live in the castle. I want to eat at your table. I want to sleep in your bed. And the princess said, of course, frog. And down into the pond, and up came the ball. And the girl took that ball, and not her first mistake, but her worst mistake, she said goodbye, frog, and ran as fast as her strong legs could take her back to the castle, slammed the door, and sat down to a sumptuous meal with her father, the king, her mother, the queen, and the royal siblings. As they were eating, there was a sound. Horrible. Plop, plop, plop. And somehow that frog knocked on the door. It's a fairy tale, so knock. Or I guess it'd be like splat, splat, splat. And the king said, did you hear that? And the daughter said, I heard nothing. And the queen said, there is a knock at the door. Young daughter, go see who is at the door. She went, she knew what was there, opened the door, looked down and said, frog, I am here for you to complete your promise to me. No, slammed the door on the frog back to the table. And the queen said, who was there? And the daughter answered truthfully, there was nobody there. Not any person, Mom. Okay, they sat down when splat, splat, splat. Go and see who it is. There is no person there. And the queen said, I will find it. She goes to the door. She opens it up. She looks out. She doesn't see anything. She comes back. Our daughter was telling the truth, King. There is nobody there. They're eating their meal again when splat, splat. And the king goes and he looks and he hears, down here, King. And he looks at the frog. Ah, a magic talking frog. Yes, your daughter promised me something and she will not keep her promise. What was the promise? I helped her find her golden ball. Oh, her golden ball, her favorite toy. And she said, I could be the royal pet. My daughter promised that. Yes, then you will be the royal pet. And in came the frog, splop, splop, next to the table, plop, on the table, next to her plate, splop. He said, daughter, I will now eat from your plate. And that frog, and she was so disgusted she could not eat anymore. He said, I am full. I will now take a nap in your bed. She said, you will not. And the father said, what you asked and what you promised must be completed. Come, frog. The frog slatted up the steps onto the royal bed, splat, and she looked at it, and he said, I will now have your pillow. She said, you will not, frog. And this is where it turns a little bit. It ends up okay, but I just want you to not freak out. It's okay. Okay. She grabs that frog. You've heard the version where she kisses the frog. The original version, she takes that frog and splats it against the wall, and there's frog goo everywhere. It starts to slide down in a horrible mess. And when that bloody mess touches the ground, out comes a beautiful boy. And he looks at her, and she looks at him, and they lived. And this is how it says in the book, happily until they died.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.